Greetings, Stoutlaws. At this point, most of you have probably moved on from Mordhau, but for those of us still stuck in the trenches, your departure has definitely been noticed. For the first time in the game's lifespan, the average consecutive player count tanked under 2,000 and was only partially stabilised with the release of Jester outfits. With only one large content patch on the distant horizon in the form of Easter Invasion, we are now in the death spiral phase of the game. Chivalry 1 veterans will recognise the pattern. Casual players have either left or have hardened enough to join the Tryhard Legion, and new players are unable to break through the remaining small population of melee gods. Some people, including Crush, the Mordhau gameplay dev, will argue this is a natural cycle due to the melee genre being inherently niche. I'm of the exact opposite opinion, and I've already been called crazy for thinking that the first-person melee genre will one day surpass first-person shooters. You could argue it's happening already, as the best-selling game of all time, with everyone and their grandmothers owning a copy on multiple devices, is Minecraft, which is technically a melee game. Of course, the combat isn't anything to write home about unless you're one of those Zoomer freaks spamming LMB in competitive Minecraft, which shockingly has a bigger scene than Mordhau, but to me this seems more of a competition to develop arthritis before age 20, but I digress. A certain silver-tongued salesman has probably convinced you to purchase multiple editions of the most well-known RPG of all time, Skyrim, and Skyrim's success is closely rivaled by The Witcher 3. Both of these prominently feature melee combat. Looking at the top recent releases, we can't ignore the highly anticipated Bannerlord, which managed to peak at 250k concurrent players, and Valheim, which doubled that number. In both of these indie games, players were able to overlook early access in order to experience gameplay beyond shooting guns for a change. Civ 2 also managed to sell over 1 million copies, although I suspect the player retention wasn't great. So clearly there is demand for melee combat, but so far neither Chivalry or Mordhau has held down a player base for PvP melee. The biggest factor for why that's the case can be determined by examining the long-standing successes of other PvP games. CSGO, Valorant, Dota, League of Legends, Rainbow Six, Rocket League, PUBG, Fortnite, Apex, COD, they span genres but all contain something in common: small team-based competitive matchmaking. The most popular format is 5v5, which is probably the ideal ratio of allowing good players to have an impact on the outcome of a match, while simultaneously allowing underperformers to still sometimes win on the back of their team. This is why top players don't really enjoy Mordhau's 64 player modes, because they can drop over 100 kills and still lose the match, and it's also why no variety streamers like Summit or XQC can stream ranked 1v1 for longer than an hour, because it's too stressful. Tritonian did eventually release a ranked 3v3 mode into Mordhau a year after launch, but it was as bare bones as you could get. Poorly optimised maps, playing last team standing where individual player performance is still very much the deciding factor due to how teamfights operate. Even so, this patch was clearly the most successful at bringing returning players back to the game, peaking its over 10k concurrents, something that had not happened since the first 3 months post-launch. Tritonian, ignoring this genre-transcending formula for success, is their most bizarre omission, especially when you consider that several members of the original dev team came from a comp Shiv background, pouring thousands of hours into small team objective matches. In the alpha testing, they took gameplay feedback from a dedicated group of comp players, which was largely the case post-launch as well. Despite all of this, they dropped the competitive ball entirely, not even attempting to convert any of their fair-weather casual audience into hardcore players. So unsurprisingly, the game's lifespan mimics many other flavour of the month titles. I believe this decision was made sometime during pre-alpha, where the team collectively decided to aim for a medieval battlefield approach as opposed to the more competitive small team factor. This decision clearly did well in terms of initial sales, but has now left Mordhau in its current predicament, where big patches require massive maps taking years to complete. This is in stark contrast to CSGO or Valorant, where very few maps or updates in general get added, but players are satisfied with the endless replayability the existing maps offer, as players instead hone their skills and rank up rather than explore new locations. More developers were hired this year, but we've yet to see this translate into more frequent updates. If you suffer from Stockholm Syndrome like these posters, you might even blame me for the decline in player count due to my past videos critiquing the game. However, I believe I've done as much as I reasonably can to keep Mordhau going, including designing the only functioning comp game mode, Gold Rush. Initially, I sent a document of the mode to the devs to look over, but nobody really engaged with it, which is fair enough I suppose, as it was just an unproven Google Doc at this stage. Later, we managed to do some testing thanks to Solved, who produced a playable prototype. I uploaded videos of these tests, but again failed to spark the devs' interest. To my amazement, Wheeze, and then later Despacito, with the lending hand of Eggplant, forged a fully functioning mod which has been incredible to play on. It was a true community effort, and whether you like the mode or not, it is the only one to have been played besides Skirmish. Crush called Gold Rush dog bleed, and apparently the other devs didn't like it either, which again I don't mind so long as they provided an alternative. They failed to do so every turn. At one point they tried shoving the economy system from Gold Rush into Skirmish, which flopped predictably. Later, they would go on to purchase the Captain's mod from Despacito, which is a very polished mod, but doesn't have great gameplay in my opinion, as it's basically a worse version of Skirmish. Despite buying the mod, the devs would then decide not to put it into the core game, basically wasting their money, although I'm very glad Despo got paid for his work. Other attempts were started with the Capture the Flag modes, but likewise, these went nowhere. And so, Mordhau never received an official competitive game mode, as when it comes to mode design, Tritonian are creatively bankrupt. The one functioning 5v5 mode that miraculously fell into their laps was sneered at, and rather than continue to think about creating any, Crush has instead adopted the narrative that there's never been much demand for competitive melee in the first place, so focusing on it is pointless. You'd expect this strategy would involve a greater focus on casual content. You'd be mistaken, as this year has been the driest to date. The complete lack of content in a time period where many have been stuck at home is a huge blunder. Gameplay is of course another factor in Mordhau's demise. Whilst it's still the best to date, there's plenty of issues, some of which I've covered previously, such as the chamber predicament and dragging. Check these videos out if you haven't already, as I go into plenty of detail. In general, there's a lot of hidden mechanics that make it difficult to access for new players. Unlike the simplicity of the first-person shooter, this isn't something I believe is inherent within the melee genre, but there's been very little experimenting from Tritonian, despite practically holding a monopoly of the genre until Shiv 2 came out. The tutorial has yet to receive an overhaul since the game released. No official modding tools is a common critique I suspect is overweighted when it comes to Mordhau's decline, as I believe it's up to the devs themselves to keep the game afloat. Although I can't imagine how frustrating it is for the modding community to see their existing work with the unofficial modding tools break after each new patch, and I wonder how many modders will be remaining when the SDK does finally drop. Tritonian certainly missed another open goal opportunity to adapt existing mods in their working state into the base game. For example, Eggplant's Sword Game and Infection Game modes are both very fun and polished enough to go alongside official content. Likewise, considering there is a shortage of maps, you'd expect Tritonian to hire some map designers from the modding community, notably Despacito, whose modded maps really stand out. Alarmingly, Mordhau doesn't seem to have any anti-cheat, and I've encountered the occasional blatant hacker in ranked. I don't play pubs, so I'm not sure if they're more rampant in the larger servers. The official Mordhau moderators really shine here, and if you do find a cheater, make sure to record them in action and include their player ID by typing player list into the console. Send the mods the footage, including the player ID, and they'll get banned within a few minutes. The scarier element of this is the concept of closet cheaters lurking, something we've encountered before in the comp scene. Okay, what? Okay, I even leant back that time. I can't parry it, they just go straight through.
Look at this. Give me a repost. This is what I do, man.
Most comp players are pretty paranoid people, and everyone tends to freely accuse everyone else, usually lightheartedly, and there's even this one guy on Reddit convinced I use cheats to adjust my aim, one of the least impactful aspects of the genre. Hopefully my recent video of dueling Bear without my Y-axis enabled eased his mind. The community is often demonized, but I again think this argument is overrated, as it's no more toxic than any of the biggest multiplayer titles out there, although this genre is particularly infuriating due to the up-close and personal nature of the combat. One instance where this is undoubtedly true is nearly every tournament across all regions, no matter the size, will consistently get DDoSed, which presumably is just one guy that's absolutely got it in for Mordhau. Felony be damned. Speaking of tournaments, again, Tritonian deserve criticism, as besides Spook donating $2,000 to a charity boxing tourney, not a single penny has been put up as far as I'm aware. Giving out in-game gold to players with thousands of hours clocked, in my opinion, is an insult. This decision was partly due to beef between Crush and EU comp players like Giru and Rise. Crush was adamant that no prize money should ever fall into their hands, and as we all played on VK, which was the most dominant team in EU, this basically meant there was no chance of official prize pools. Again, this is truly baffling decision making, seeing Giru's and my own tourney videos of football hooliganism and Spartan trolling are some of the most popular on YouTube, and probably how a large chunk of players even discovered Mordhau in the first place, so Crush essentially chopped off his nose to spite his face. There's also some stories of Tritonian rejecting potential ESL events due to silly disagreements. Allegedly, ESL wanted to run events on Team Deathmatch as it was the only mode they understood, and Tritonian were insisting on Skirmish, so eventually ESL walked away. And apparently, there is also another org wanting to pay Tritonian to make a mode and a map for them, All the org wanted in return was permission to put their branding on the map, and this broke down the negotiation. Those details could be off as it's largely hearsay, but it wouldn't surprise me in the least considering how poorly the competitive scene has been handled. When it comes to the dev team, Crush is usually the most forward-facing as the gameplay designer, and alongside his toxic personality, after all he's a comp shiv player, he is often getting the brunt of the blame. Often deservingly, but whilst I like all of the devs individually, there has to be more to the failings than just Crush. When it became clear the community's high expectations were not going to be met in a timely fashion, the other devs' presence largely faded away, barring a few exceptions who still engage with the community regularly. The overall lack of direction is surely a result of poor leadership, which is understandable considering it's Tritonian's first foray into game development. The surprising thing is, most of these criticisms I've covered were identified in high detail by the CEO, Marox, who made a fantastic statement 2 years ago. Feel free to pause and read the post in full, but he basically covers the identity crisis that was Mordhau 6 months post-launch, how they could potentially focus on small team engagements moving forward given their background, and how they weren't opposed to trying out different game modes. When I read this 2 years ago, I felt hopeful. Now when I read it, all I can wonder is, what the hell happened? As for me, I've basically moved on from Mordhau at this stage. The frustrating parts of the game far outweigh the good, and I just don't enjoy playing it anymore. This video contains some of my last remaining clips in my folder, and whilst I still occasionally play, I have no plans for future Mordhau content. Possibly I'll scrape together another video or two. I still offer coaching, although with the lack of players this hasn't been too popular, plus I'm pretty washed. As for Contingent, the metagame I'm working on as the combat designer, the Kickstarter which was initially going to be launching around now has been delayed to early next year due to part shortages preventing a motion capture suit delivery. You can expect to see a lot of content for Contingent when it's ready. If you're really desperate for more Stouty videos right now, then check out my old Chivalry 1 content if you haven't already, as I think they've aged pretty well. And if I missed any factors for why you quit Mordhau, start a discussion in the comments.